Hello all, it's Mr. Anderson. I'm screencasting some of the lessons this week just so you can get a taste of the lessons that you may be receiving in your classroom. The focus will remain the same, but of course slides might be different. I might change things around, but the brief focus that I'll say here will be the same. So the week's focus so far is to explore the nature of Robbie's narrative so we can see how the change in form reflects his experiences. Two things that we're going to want you to focus on is to recount what was a Proustian moment for Robbie in part 1, and there's some videos elsewhere for you to look at, and also to consider what would a Marxist critic be interested in during the end of part 1 of Atonement, particularly in relation to how Marshall is treated and how he treats the police. So what we're going to do is have you look at all of the extracts in the last lesson of this week, and you wanted to maybe focus yourselves on one of the assessment foci, but you can look at all of them with every focus if you wish. So ultimately, these are the two extracts and that show the greatest contrast. One, the Proustian moment for Robbie in part 1, and the other one is reflection when he's in Dunkirk of his experiences in prison. You need to make sure that you annotate all the major extracts with your own AO and the AO1 for homework. You may very well annotate all the extracts with all the assessment objectives as you choose. So the lesson that you should be looking at is exploring how McEwan challenges our perception of Dunkirk, and we can do this in order so we can appreciate key pieces of context, our AO3. The three key things to think about are to understand the dominant readings of Dunkirk and how it is seen in other people, to see how McEwan undermines that dominant perception of Dunkirk, then finally try to decide which piece of context as a class do we think is most significant in relation to understanding Robbie's narrative, again, from his experiences in Dunkirk. So this graphic here is being chosen because it shows something about the surreal nature of the Dunkirk experience, and it's actually part of a wonderful one shot in 5 minutes, one take shot, that really is worth watching. Just out of interest, it was actually cut 3 times, but the actual shot itself appears to be utterly seamless. So this video that you can see shows a dominant tone of the Dunkirk experience according to Pathé News. The dominant perception of Dunkirk is that whilst it is a colossal military disaster, it also somehow gives the British nation an important boost to morale. And the reason why, of course, is part of this myth of the British stiff upper lip and how people on an island respond to threats by buckling down and refusing to give up. This, of course, led to Churchill's famous speech, "We will fight on the beaches, we will fight them all in various places." And this is a very interesting video that you're going to see that again demonstrates a romanticized impression of Churchill as he says this. So McEwan undermines this Dunkirk spirit, and we're going to want you to look in particular at this piece of evidence here, and then also begin to look at this idea of how the results of war are being made specific, and again this sense here of how Dunkirk is being experienced by those suffering it. So we're then going to give you 4 pieces of context, with the 5th one really being something that we're going to talk about to you perhaps separately. These 4 pieces are class attitudes to war, with a focus on the middle upper class, the infantry's dislike of the RAF, recognizing of course that the infantry is often the lower classes and the RAF would have been taken largely from the middle upper classes, Uncle Clem's vase and how it represents a distortion of time and place, and then finally the senselessness of war. We'll show you something also about a literary allusion that you should find interesting as well. So the first variable is based on class attitudes towards war, and particularly how the upper middle class were really unprepared for the realities of war, and how they had this imperialistic idea of the world that, frankly, in Britain still exists somewhat today. Those of you that would get the second variable are going to be considering how is this infantry's dislike of the RAF demonstrated in the text. And again, there are some horrific moral choices that need to be made from those in the infantry, and you're going to see some of this tension. What's particularly interesting, of course, now if we look at the third variable, this has jumped somewhat, is that Uncle Clem's vase seems to represent some of the celebration of war. And again, that symbolic representation of a celebration of war is also going to be symbolic of other things as well. And we'll see if you can try to pick some of that out and see how that's going to help you analyze Robbie's numb narrative. The fourth variable is about the surreal nature of war, the senselessness of death. And if we're looking at the higher up, that is met by Robbie, who's described like a duck in a box, who also calls Robbie a disgrace. This officer really represents something about how soldiers are treated in a relatively senseless manner. We're also going to want to see as well how Robbie's voice is distinctly that of an English country house novel character. And he brings in this domestic imagery as well. And again, we're going to see if you can perhaps look at this idea of how he dies and how he senses his own death. Does this make anything of his death more tragic? And how does this relate to the Dunkirk experience and the country house novel? So back to the second variable here, and this will be changed, of course. We want you to see this focus on the excitement of violence. We'll see if you can explore this somewhat and see if that kind of conflict will help you analyze Robbie's numb narrative. The fifth variable we'll talk to you a bit about is demonstrating something that is really personal and literary, but is trying to be historicized. And there's certainly an element of movement of soldiers being clean and brave and exciting, to in the Second World War being desolate, and there's not a sense of honor in war as there once was. And we're going to see what you think about that. Finally, once you've done all this, as a class, we're going to look to see if you can contextualize which piece of context is the most interesting, and more importantly than that, which piece of context might help you analyze Robbie's numb narrative most effectively. So enjoy, and we look forward to seeing you in this lesson.